Jamal had always known his job wasn't just about fighting fires. As one of the few black firefighters in the city, he was constantly reminded that for him, the battles extended beyond the flames. Every day, he walked into the station with the unspoken weight of proving himself, not just as a firefighter, but as a black man in a predominantly white workplace. At 35, Jamal had earned his spot. He was reliable, calm under pressure, and had saved more lives than he could count. But no matter how many fires he put out, there were some he couldn't control. The subtle, burning remarks from his colleagues. "Oh, Jamal, you don't have to work so hard," they'd joke. "We know you're fast enough to run circles around us." It wasn't the first time they'd hinted at stereotypes, and it wouldn't be the last. It was always delivered with a smile, always casual, as if it didn't sting as much as it did. Some days, he tried to ignore it, focusing on the job at hand, but it was hard when exclusion followed him everywhere. Whether it was being left out of conversations about upcoming opportunities or being the butt of offhand comments, Jamal felt the suffocating presence of isolation. Most of his colleagues didn't even realize how their behavior affected him, or maybe they just didn't care. One afternoon, as Jamal was polishing his equipment, the conversation in the locker room caught his ear. "Yeah, they're really cracking down on us hiring quotas now," one of the guys said. "We gotta make sure we have enough diversity hires. You know?" They all laughed. Jamal gripped the cloth in his hand a little tighter. He was tired of this, tired of feeling like an outsider, like his hard work was always minimized, reduced to nothing more than fulfilling a quota. That night, Jamal lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. He'd been a firefighter for over a decade, yet moments like today made him feel like he was still fighting for acceptance. His girlfriend, Tanya, a teacher who was just as familiar with being the only black face in the room, noticed his restlessness. "What's on your mind, babe?" she asked, turning over to face him. "Just the usual," he sighed. "Work stuff." She knew what that meant. "It's not right, Jamal. You work twice as hard as anyone else, but they don't give you half the respect." I know," Jamal replied. "But what can I do? I can't just call them out every time." Tanya reached for his hand. "Maybe not every time, but you don't have to carry this alone. They're wrong, Jamal, and you deserve better." Jamal squeezed her hand, appreciating her support, but in his mind, the question lingered. Could he really do something about it? Or was this just the way things were always going to be? Jamal's day had been long, filled with back-to-back calls and the constant tension that followed him around the firehouse. He was exhausted, eager to get home, and just relax for a few hours before his next shift. The drive home usually helped clear his mind, but tonight was different. As he turned the corner into his neighborhood, he noticed the flashing red and blue lights of a police car behind him. At first, he didn't think much of it. Jamal had always been careful. His license was up to date, his registration clean, and he knew he hadn't broken any traffic laws. Still, the sight of the police car made his stomach tighten. It was a feeling he had grown up with, an unshakable fear that, no matter how careful he was, things could go wrong. The siren blared once, signaling for him to pull over. Jamal complied, pulling his truck to the side of the road, heart pounding in his chest. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as the officer approached. The window slid down slowly as Jamal kept his hands visible, just like he'd always been taught. "License and registration," the officer demanded, his voice cold and detached. Jamal handed over the documents, trying to stay calm. "Is there a problem, officer?" "You tell me," the cop responded, giving him a once-over. "You look like you're in a hurry. Where are you headed?" "I'm just heading home from work," Jamal explained, motioning to his fire department uniform still creased from the day's work. The officer glanced at the uniform, then back at Jamal's face, as if weighing whether to believe him. "Step out of the vehicle." Jamal froze for a moment. "Excuse me." "You heard me. Step out of the vehicle," the officer repeated, his hand now resting on his belt, close to his gun. Jamal could feel his pulse quicken. He had no idea what he'd done wrong, but he knew better than argue. Slowly, he unbuckled his seatbelt and got out of the truck. As soon as he stood up, two more officers approached, both watching him closely. Hands on the hood. One of them barked. Jamal hesitated for a second, his mind racing. He was in uniform. He was a firefighter, for God's sake. What could they possibly think he was doing? But he didn't argue. He did as they said, placing his hands on the hood of his truck. One officer patted him down roughly, while the others kept a close eye on him. The search was invasive, humiliating. They found nothing, of course, but that didn't stop them from keeping him there, treating him like a criminal. "Why did you stop me?" Jamal asked, his voice tight with frustration. The officer shrugged. "Just doing our job. You look suspicious." Suspicious. That word hung in the air like smoke. Jamal couldn't believe what was happening. Suspicious? He was a firefighter coming home from work. His mind replayed the events over and over. The humiliation was suffocating. He felt powerless and worse. He knew that in their eyes, his uniform didn't matter. His skin did. After what felt like an eternity, the officers finally let him go. No apology, no explanation, just a cold warning to be careful next time. Jamal got back into his truck, hands shaking as he gripped the steering wheel. He sat there for a few minutes, staring ahead in disbelief. The anger swelled inside him, but so did the helplessness. How could this happen to him, even after everything he'd accomplished? It didn't matter how many fires he'd put out, how many lives he'd saved. None of it shielded him from this. That night, as Jamal pulled into his driveway, the weight of what had just happened hit him harder than he expected. He had been humiliated, reduced to nothing more than another black man in the wrong place at the wrong time. And for the first time in a long time, Jamal wasn't sure he could just let it go. The following days were a blur of frustration and disbelief for Jamal. Every time he walked into the firehouse, it felt different. He wasn't sure if it was his own mind playing tricks on him, or if his co-workers had always looked at him the way they did now. The quiet glances, the hushed conversations, the offhand jokes, they all piled on top of the rage already simmering inside him. He had told Tanya about the police stop the night it happened. She listened with a mix of anger and heartbreak in her eyes. "You can't let them get away with this, Jamal," she had said. "You have to speak out." But what could he do? He was just one man, up against a system that had been built to keep people like him in their place. Jamal had always tried to keep his head down, to work hard and prove that he was more than the color of his skin. But now, all that felt pointless. No matter how hard he worked, it would never be enough. The firehouse became a minefield. His interactions with his colleagues were strained at best. Some of them still joked, oblivious to the storm brewing inside him. Others seemed to sense the shift in his mood but didn't dare ask. And then there were the ones who had always made him feel small, the ones who saw him as less. Jamal could feel their stares every time he walked into the room. He felt as though they were waiting for him to snap. One afternoon, while the crew was on a break, Jamal overheard a conversation that pushed him over the edge. A group of his colleagues was talking about the latest news story. A black man had been wrongfully arrested in a neighboring city. Well, if he didn't want trouble, he should have known better than to be out there looking shady. One of the men said, laughing. You know how they are. Jamal's heart raced. He could feel the anger boiling up inside him. It was one thing to experience the injustice himself, but to hear them casually dismiss it, to laugh about it, was too much. He stood up abruptly, causing the room to fall silent. "What the hell did you just say?" Jamal's voice was low, but his tone was sharp, cutting through the air like a blade. The man who had spoken looked taken aback, as if he hadn't expected Jamal to react. "I didn't mean anything by it, man. Just saying, people gotta be careful." Jamal's fists clenched at his sides. "Careful? You think it's about being careful? You think that's all it takes to avoid being harassed or arrested? Just be careful." The room was dead silent now, all eyes on Jamal. His voice grew louder, fueled by years of pent-up frustration. "I got pulled over last week for no reason. Cops treated me like a damn criminal, patted me down like I was hiding something, all because I looked suspicious. You know what that means? It means my skin was the only thing they saw." His colleagues shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke. The man who had made the comment opened his mouth, then closed it again, unsure of what to say. Jamal took a step closer, his voice shaking with anger. "You think this is a joke? You think this is just something you can laugh about because it doesn't affect you? I've worked here for years, and I'm still treated like I don't belong. And now you want to sit here and laugh about how easy it is to avoid trouble? You don't know the half of it." The tension in the room was palpable, but Jamal didn't care. He had reached his breaking point. For too long he had kept his head down, tried to ignore the comments, the looks, the casual racism that surrounded him. But no more. Without waiting for a response, Jamal turned and stormed out of the firehouse, slamming the door behind him. His heart was racing, his hands shaking as he walked to his truck. He didn't know where he was going, but he knew he couldn't stay there any longer. As he drove through the city streets, Jamal's mind raced. The rage inside him was overwhelming, but beneath it was something else, something heavier. He felt exhausted, drained by the constant weight of having to prove himself, of having to fight for respect that should have been given freely. He pulled over into an empty parking lot, resting his head against the steering wheel. The exhaustion hit him like a wave, and for the first time in a long time, Jamal felt tears well up in his eyes. He had always prided himself on being strong, on not letting things get to him. But now, it felt like everything was crashing down at once. Jamal didn't know what to do next. He couldn't go back to the firehouse, not after what had just happened. But he also couldn't stay silent anymore. Something had to change. Jamal didn't go back to the firehouse that day. Instead, he drove aimlessly around the city, trying to clear his mind. The anger still simmered beneath the surface. But now there was something else, an urgency he hadn't felt before. The words he had shouted at his colleagues echoed in his head, but they no longer felt enough. Talking wasn't enough. He needed to do something. Later that evening, Jamal found himself at Tanya's apartment. She opened the door and took one look at him before pulling him into a hug. He hadn't said much on the phone, but she knew him well enough to see the weight he was carrying. "Talk to me," she said softly, guiding him to the couch. Jamal sat down, feeling the exhaustion from the day hit him like a ton of bricks. "I lost it today, Tanya. I snapped at them." Tanya sat beside him, waiting patiently for him to explain. They were joking about racism, about how black people get treated by the police like it's no big deal. "I couldn't take it anymore," he sighed, rubbing his hands over his face. "I told them about what happened to me last week, how I got pulled over for nothing. And you know what? They just stood there, awkward, like I'd ruined their fun." Tanya listened intently, her eyes filled with empathy. "You did the right thing, Jamal. They needed to hear it." "I don't know," Jamal muttered. "I feel like I've been putting up with this crap for so long. The way they look at me, the jokes, the assumptions. I thought I could just keep my head down, do my job, and it would go away. But it's not going away. It's getting worse." Tanya reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "You don't have to deal with this alone. You know that, right? You've been strong for so long, but you're not in this fight by yourself." Jamal was silent for a moment, letting her words sink in. For years, he had tried to carry the weight of his experiences alone, thinking that it was his burden to bear. But now, sitting here with Tanya, he realized that he didn't have to. "I want to fight this, Tanya," Jamal said quietly. "I don't know how yet, but I need to fight back." Tanya's eyes lit up with determination. "Then let's figure it out. You've got a voice, Jamal. You can speak up, expose what's happening, not just to you but to all of us." The thought of speaking out publicly was daunting. Jamal had always preferred to stay in the background, to keep his personal struggles private. But now, after everything that had happened, he knew he couldn't stay silent anymore. "I don't know where to start," Jamal admitted, feeling a knot of anxiety in his stomach. "We'll start by telling your story," Tanya said confidently. "You're not just a victim, Jamal. You're a firefighter, a leader in your community. If people hear what you've been through, they'll listen." Jamal looked at her, feeling a flicker of hope. Maybe she was right. Maybe his story could make a difference. Over the next few days, Jamal and Tanya began putting together a plan. Tanya, with her background in journalism, helped him organize his thoughts and frame his story in a way that would resonate with others. She encouraged him to document not just his recent experiences with the police, but the years of discrimination he had faced within the fire department as well. At first, the idea of going public scared him. What would his colleagues say? How would the department react? But the more he thought about it, the more Jamal realized that he couldn't let fear stop him. If he didn't speak up, nothing would change. One evening, as they were sitting on Tanya's balcony, Jamal felt a sense of clarity wash over him. "I'm going to do this," he said, his voice steady. "I'm going to fight." Tanya smiled at him, proud of the resolve she saw in his eyes. "You're doing the right thing, Jamal. This is bigger than you. You're standing up for all of us." Jamal nodded, feeling the weight of her words. For the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of purpose. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about fighting for justice, for every black man and woman who had been treated as less, for every person who had been silenced. He knew the road ahead would be hard. There would be pushback, resistance, maybe even threats. But Jamal was ready. He had spent his entire life trying to prove that he was worthy, that he deserved to be where he was. Now, it was time to demand the respect and justice he had been denied. Jamal's decision to speak out felt empowering at first, but it wasn't long before the reality of what he was about to do began to sink in. As he stood outside the firehouse the next morning, a wave of anxiety hit him. He knew that once his story was out, there would be no turning back. He walked into the building, his heart pounding. His colleagues were gathered in the common area, laughing and talking as if nothing had changed. But for Jamal, everything felt different. He saw the faces of the men he had worked with for years, men who had never truly seen him as one of them, and he felt a familiar knot of resentment in his chest. As he approached, one of the guys, Mike, a tall, broad-shouldered firefighter, called out to him, "Hey, Jamal, you good, man?" Jamal forced a tight smile. "Yeah, I'm good." But he wasn't. His mind was already racing, thinking about the fallout that would come once his story hit the media. Would these men still stand by him? Or would they turn their backs the way they had when he'd spoken up before? Later that day, during a quiet moment, Jamal pulled his phone from his pocket and scrolled through the emails Tanya had sent him. She had connected him with a local journalist who was interested in covering his story. The interview was scheduled for the following week. His thumb hovered over the email, and for a moment, doubt crept in. Was this really the right move? Exposing the fire department, calling out the police? It felt like throwing gasoline on a fire that was already burning out of control. But then he remembered the way his colleagues had laughed about racism, the way they had dismissed his experiences as if they were nothing. And he remembered the terror he had felt during that traffic stop, when he'd been treated like a criminal for no reason other than the color of his skin. No, he couldn't back down now. The following week, the interview took place in a quiet cafe. Jamal sat across from the journalist, a woman named Jessica, who had a notepad and recorder in front of her. She was in her early 30s with short, curly hair and a sharp, no-nonsense demeanor. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me, Jamal," Jessica said, offering him a warm but professional smile. Jamal nodded, feeling the tension in his chest. "Yeah, thanks for doing this." Jessica clicked the recorder on and leaned forward slightly. "I want to start by asking about your experiences in the fire department. What has it been like working there as a black man?" Jamal took a deep breath and began to speak. At first, his words were measured, careful. He recounted the small slights, the jokes, the offhand comments that had chipped away at him over the years. But as he talked, the dam began to break. He told her about the way his white colleagues had treated him, how they had questioned his competence, his place among them. And then he told her about the night he was stopped by the police, the humiliation, the fear. By the time he finished, his hands were shaking slightly. Jessica sat in silence for a moment, letting his words hang in the air. "Jamal, this is a powerful story," she said quietly. "It's going to resonate with a lot of people. But I need you to be sure about this. Once this goes public, there's no taking it back." Jamal looked her in the eyes, his heart pounding. "I'm sure," he said, his voice steady. "People need to know." In the days following the interview, Jamal's anxiety grew. He hadn't told anyone at the firehouse about the article, but he knew it was only a matter of time before they found out. He could feel the tension building, and every interaction with his colleagues felt like a ticking time bomb. Then the article went live. It didn't take long for it to make waves. The headline read, "Racism in the Ranks, a Firefighter Speaks Out." Jamal's story quickly spread through social media, gaining attention from activists, local news outlets, and even politicians. Jamal felt a mix of emotions as the article took off. On one hand, he was proud of himself for speaking out, for standing up for what was right. But on the other hand, he was bracing himself for the backlash. The firehouse was quiet when he arrived for his next shift. Too quiet. As soon as he walked through the doors, he felt the weight of their stares on him. No one said a word, but the air was thick with tension. Jamal went about his routine, trying to stay focused, but the silence was deafening. He knew they had all seen the article, and he could feel their judgment, their anger simmering just beneath the surface. Finally, Mike broke the silence. "So, Jamal," he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm, "you're famous now, huh?" Jamal turned to face him, meeting his gaze head-on. "I just told the truth." Mike scoffed. "Yeah, well, some of us don't appreciate you dragging the whole department through the mud." The room went still, and all eyes were on Jamal. He felt the tension in his chest tighten, but he stood his ground. "Maybe if the department wasn't so full of racism, I wouldn't have to." Mike took a step toward him, his face hardening. "Watch yourself, man. You're making enemies." The days following the article were some of the toughest Jamal had ever faced. The firehouse, once filled with camaraderie, had turned cold. Every shift felt like walking into a storm, and he was the target. Whispers followed him wherever he went, but when he looked, his colleagues would quickly turn away. Even more stressful were the emails and social media messages pouring in. Some were supportive, people thanking him for his bravery, for speaking out. But just as many were hostile. The comment sections on the article were full of venom. "You're just trying to play the race card," one person wrote. "Firefighters are heroes, not racists," said another. At home, Jamal found it hard to sleep. He kept replaying the interview in his head, wondering if he had said too much, if he had gone too far. The doubts gnawed at him. Every time his phone buzzed, a knot formed in his stomach. But amid the chaos, there were moments of hope. A small group of black firefighters from neighboring stations reached out to him, expressing their support. "You're not alone in this," one message read. "What you're doing matters." Those words gave Jamal the strength to keep going, but the stress was taking its toll. One afternoon, as he sat in his kitchen staring at the news coverage of his story, Tanya called. She had been keeping a close eye on him since the article went live, worried about how he was handling the pressure. "Hey, Jamal," Tanya said gently. "How are you holding up?" Jamal sighed, rubbing his temples. "Honestly, it's been rough. I didn't think it would blow up like this." "You knew it would be tough," Tanya reminded him. "But you're doing something important. This is bigger than just you." "I know," Jamal said, his voice heavy. "But sometimes I wonder if it's worth it. The guys at the station, they hate me now. It's like I don't belong there anymore." "You didn't belong there in the first place," Tanya replied sharply. "Not if they couldn't see you for who you are." Jamal paused, her words cutting deep. She was right. He had always felt like an outsider, trying to fit into a world that wasn't made for him. And now, he had broken the unspoken rule. He had dared to speak out, to challenge the status quo. Tanya's voice softened. "Listen, I know this is hard, but you've already started something. You can't turn back now. And you're not alone in this, Jamal. You've got people behind you." He nodded, even though she couldn't see him. "Thanks, Tanya. I just needed to hear that." The next morning, as Jamal walked into the firehouse, the tension was still thick in the air. His colleagues barely acknowledged him, and those who did shot him cold, disapproving looks. He had expected as much, but it didn't make it any easier. As the shift went on, he noticed more subtle acts of hostility. His gear was moved to a different locker. His tools were misplaced. It was clear that the others were trying to push him out, to make him feel unwelcome. But Jamal refused to be intimidated. He went about his work with quiet determination, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing him break. Later that day, the firehouse received a call. There was a fire at a local apartment building. It was a big one, the kind that would test every firefighter's skill and courage. Jamal suited up with the others, his heart racing. As they arrived on the scene, flames roared from the building, thick smoke billowing into the sky. People were screaming, running from the building, and a few were trapped on the upper floors, waving frantically from the windows. Without hesitation, Jamal grabbed his equipment and headed toward the building, his instincts kicking in. He didn't think about the tension at the station or the way his colleagues had been treating him. In that moment, all that mattered was saving lives. As he approached the entrance, Mike stepped in front of him, blocking his path. "Where do you think you're going?" Mike's tone was sharp, his eyes narrowing. Jamal frowned, confusion mixing with frustration. "What are you talking about?" "I'm going in." Mike shook his head. No, you're not. We don't need you here. Jamal's heart pounded. Are you serious right now? People are trapped in there. Yeah, and we don't need you screwing things up. Mike shot back, his voice cold. Jamal clenched his fists, anger bubbling up inside him. This isn't about me. This is about those people in there. Let me do my job. But Mike didn't budge. We don't trust you, Jamal. You've made it pretty clear you don't want to be part of this team. Jamal's mind raced, the fire still roaring behind them. He could hear the screams of the people inside, the crackling of the flames. He couldn't just stand there and do nothing. Finally, Jamal pushed past Mike, not caring about the consequences. He sprinted toward the building, his heart pounding in his chest. As he entered the burning structure, the heat hit him like a wall, but he pushed forward, determined to save whoever he could. Inside, the smoke was thick, making it hard to see. Jamal heard a child's cry coming from one of the rooms and rushed toward the sound. He found a little girl huddled in the corner, tears streaming down her face. Without hesitation, Jamal scooped her up and made his way back through the thick smoke. His lungs burned, and every step felt like a battle, but he kept going. Finally, he emerged from the building, the little girl clinging to him as he handed her off to a paramedic. As Jamal caught his breath, he looked around for Mike. His colleagues stood nearby, watching him with a mixture of surprise and begrudging respect. For the first time in weeks, Jamal felt like himself again. He had done what he came to do. He had saved a life. And no one could take that from him. After the harrowing rescue, Jamal felt a surge of adrenaline course through him. The sense of purpose that had eluded him for so long flooded back, igniting a fire within. As he stepped outside, he was met with the chaotic scene of firefighters battling the blaze and paramedics attending to the evacuated residents. The little girl he saved was safe now, wrapped in a blanket and sipping water offered by a kind-hearted neighbor. Jamal watched her for a moment, feeling a mix of relief and pride. It reminded him why he had joined the fire department in the first place, to make a difference, to save lives. But as he caught his breath, he realized the shift in dynamics back at the firehouse hadn't magically resolved itself. Mike approached him, a grudging respect flickering in his eyes. You did good, Jamal. I didn't think you'd actually go in there. Jamal turned to him, holding back a sarcastic reply. I'm here to do my job, Mike, not just stand around. Yeah, I get that now, Mike admitted, looking away. But it doesn't change what happened. You know that, right? As they stood amid the chaos, Jamal felt the weight of that truth. The underlying tension in the firehouse hadn't disappeared just because he had made a daring move. He realized that he needed to channel this moment into something bigger. Over the next few days, as Jamal returned to the firehouse, he noticed a change in the atmosphere. While some colleagues still shot him glares, others seemed to regard him with newfound admiration. They had witnessed his courage firsthand, and it began to shift their perspectives. Encouraged by this change, Jamal decided to organize a meeting with his fellow firefighters. It was time to address the issues head-on, to create a space where they could discuss the racism and discrimination that had plagued the department for too long. He spoke to Tanya, who was supportive as always. This is your chance, Jamal. You're already being seen as a leader. Use it to spark real change. The following week, Jamal called for a meeting, emphasizing the importance of open dialogue. He sent out a memo detailing the topics he wanted to cover, including the need for diversity training and the establishment of a committee to address discrimination. The day of the meeting, Jamal felt a mix of excitement and dread. He entered the common room, where several of his colleagues had gathered. The air was thick with tension, but he was determined to break through it. "Thanks for coming, everyone," Jamal began, standing at the front of the room. "I know this isn't easy, but it's necessary. We need to talk about the issues we face as a team and the problems of racism that have crept into our department." Some firefighters shifted uncomfortably, exchanging glances. Mike crossed his arms, a scowl on his face. But Jamal pushed on, sharing his experiences and those of others who had felt marginalized. As he spoke, he could see some expressions soften. A few firefighters leaned in, showing interest. He emphasized the need for a safe space for everyone to voice their concerns and to work towards real solutions. "I believe we can do better," he said, his voice steady. "We can make this firehouse a place where everyone feels welcome and valued, regardless of their background." After Jamal finished, the room fell silent. For a moment, he worried he had miscalculated, but then one of the younger firefighters, Leo, spoke up. "I've seen things too, Jamal. It's not just you. We need to talk about this." Encouraged, others began to share their own experiences, stories of subtle racism, bias, and exclusion. Jamal felt a surge of hope. The more they talked, the more barriers seemed to crumble. Mike remained quiet for much of the meeting, but as the conversation continued, Jamal noticed a shift in his demeanor. Finally, he raised his hand. "Look, I'm not proud of how I've acted," he admitted, "but I want to help. I want to be part of the solution." That statement was a turning point. The room buzzed with energy, and as they continued to discuss how to move forward, ideas flowed freely. By the end of the meeting, they had agreed to form a diversity committee and implement regular training sessions. Jamal walked away from that meeting feeling lighter, empowered. He had ignited a spark, and he was determined to fan those flames into something meaningful. The journey was just beginning, and he was ready to lead. But as he drove home, a knot of worry formed in his stomach. Would they follow through? Would the commitment to change be strong enough to withstand the pressures from outside? Days turned into weeks, and slowly, the department began to shift. The diversity committee met regularly, discussing not only issues of race, but also how to create a more inclusive environment for all. Jamal became a key player in these discussions, facilitating workshops and leading conversations that had long been avoided. The local community began to take notice as well. News of the fire department's efforts spread, and soon there were stories highlighting their commitment to change. Jamal felt a surge of pride when he saw the impact they were making, not just within the firehouse, but in the community at large. Yet, amidst the progress, Jamal also faced setbacks. Not everyone was on board with the changes, and pushback from some of his colleagues grew louder. They were resistant to the idea that the firehouse had problems to begin with. One day, as Jamal walked through the firehouse, he overheard two firefighters discussing the committee. "This is all just a PR stunt," one said dismissively. "They think we can fix things by talking about it." Jamal's heart sank. He knew that change was often met with resistance, but it still hurt to hear those words. Still, he remained focused on the goal. After another successful training session, Jamal left the firehouse feeling hopeful. He had seen firsthand how attitudes were beginning to shift, and it motivated him to keep pushing forward. Yet deep down, he knew that real change would take time. He was prepared for the fight ahead, determined to be the voice that kept advocating for justice within the ranks. As the months passed, the firehouse became a different place. Conversations about race and inclusion, once relegated to whispers, were now a regular part of the dialogue. Jamal watched as his colleagues engaged in discussions that challenged their perspectives, pushing them to confront their biases. One afternoon, Jamal was leading a training session focused on implicit bias. He stood at the front of the room, the atmosphere charged with a mix of tension and curiosity. Today, we're going to discuss how our backgrounds shape our perceptions and how those perceptions can affect our actions, he said, glancing around the room. Several firefighters shifted in their seats, some still skeptical but willing to listen. Jamal shared personal anecdotes and statistics that highlighted the disparities in treatment based on race. He emphasized the importance of empathy and understanding, encouraging his colleagues to see things from different perspectives. As he spoke, Jamal noticed Mike sitting in the back, his expression contemplative. Jamal had witnessed a transformation in Mike over the past few months. He had been more engaged and less antagonistic, actively participating in discussions rather than simply dismissing them. By the end of the session, a few firefighters began to share their own experiences. "I didn't think about how my actions could impact someone else," one admitted. Jamal felt a swell of hope. This was the change he had fought for. But as the positive momentum built, challenges still loomed. Not all firefighters were ready to embrace the new direction. A small faction continued to resist, organizing behind-the-scenes efforts to undermine the Diversity Committee. Rumors spread that the committee was a waste of resources, and they tried to sway others to their side. One evening, as Jamal was leaving the firehouse, he overheard a heated conversation between a couple of firefighters. "This is just a bunch of political correctness gone mad," one said angrily. "We're firefighters, not social workers." Jamal's heart sank. He knew that change often came with growing pains, but it was disheartening to hear the pushback. He couldn't let it deter him. Instead, he decided to address these concerns head-on. The next day, Jamal called for another meeting, this time to openly discuss the backlash against the Diversity Committee. He wanted to create a safe space for everyone to express their feelings, regardless of their stance. As the meeting began, the tension was palpable. Jamal took a deep breath and started, "I know that not everyone agrees with the direction we're heading. That's okay. What matters is that we talk about it." He opened the floor for discussion, and for the first time, the skeptics had a chance to voice their concerns. Some expressed fear that focusing on diversity would lead to reverse discrimination. Others worried that the changes would compromise their ability to do their jobs. Jamal listened intently, acknowledging their fears while gently challenging their misconceptions. Change can be uncomfortable, but it's necessary. We're not asking anyone to diminish their worth. We're asking everyone to recognize the worth in others, he explained. Slowly, the conversation shifted. Colleagues began to engage more constructively, sharing personal stories and connecting over shared experiences. Jamal felt encouraged as barriers broke down, understanding blossomed, and empathy flourished. Then, in a moment that caught everyone off guard, Mike stood up. "I was one of the guys who didn't get it," he admitted, his voice steady. "But seeing the changes and listening to Jamal, it's opened my eyes. We need this." The room erupted in murmurs of surprise, but Jamal felt a wave of relief wash over him. This was the breakthrough he had hoped for. Mike's admission opened the door for others to reconsider their positions. As the meeting wrapped up, Jamal felt a renewed sense of purpose. He knew they had a long way to go, but every small step forward was a victory. The conversation had shifted from skepticism to acceptance, and that was a significant milestone. However, just as things began to feel more stable, Jamal received an unexpected phone call. It was a local news station, interested in covering the changes happening at the firehouse. They wanted to highlight the department's efforts toward diversity and inclusion. Jamal's heart raced at the thought. This was an opportunity to showcase the progress they had made, to inspire other departments to follow suit. He quickly agreed, knowing this could amplify their message. The day of the interview arrived, and Jamal felt a mix of excitement and nerves. The reporter, a woman named Sarah, arrived with her crew, ready to film. Jamal gathered a few of his colleagues, including Mike, who had agreed to participate. As the cameras rolled, Sarah asked about the changes they were implementing. Jamal spoke passionately about the committee, the workshops, and the conversations that had taken place. He highlighted the importance of creating a safe space for all firefighters, regardless of their backgrounds. Change doesn't happen overnight, but we're committed to making a difference, he said, glancing at his colleagues for support. Mike chimed in, sharing his own transformation and how he had come to understand the issues at hand. After the interview, Jamal felt exhilarated. They had shared their stories and experiences authentically, shining a light on the positive changes happening within the firehouse. But later that evening, as Jamal watched the news segment air, he felt a knot of anxiety in his stomach. He knew that not everyone would react positively. Some would see this as a threat to their way of life, and pushback was inevitable. As expected, the fallout came quickly. Comments on social media were mixed, with many applauding the firehouse's efforts, while others criticized them for making everything about race. Jamal braced himself for the onslaught of negativity, but remained determined not to let it discourage him. In the following weeks, the pressure intensified. Some firefighters began to openly express their discontent, accusing Jamal and the committee of causing division. Jamal knew he had to stay focused on the mission at hand. Amid the turmoil, Jamal found solace in the support of his fellow committee members and the community. They held firm, determined to show that their commitment to justice and equality was stronger than the hate aimed at them. One evening, as Jamal sat on his porch reflecting on the journey, Tanya joined him with 2 mugs of coffee. "You're doing amazing work, Jamal," she said, her voice filled with warmth. "Don't let the negativity dim your light." Jamal smiled, grateful for her unwavering support. "Thanks, Tanya. It's just hard sometimes. I worry about what will happen next." "You can't control how others react," she reminded him. "But you can control your response. Keep pushing forward. The fire you've started can't be extinguished." As the sun set, casting a golden glow over the neighborhood, Jamal felt a flicker of hope ignite within him. He had faced immense challenges, but he was not alone. He had allies, supporters, and a community ready to rise alongside him. The journey ahead would be difficult, but Jamal was ready. He would continue to fight for justice, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever faced oppression and discrimination. The flame of justice had been lit, and he would ensure it burned brightly.